On this edition of the Correspondents, the battle for full control of the city of Mosul in Iraq rages on. Iraqi soldiers say the fighting has been fierce, and civilians trying to flee may be getting the worst of it. Britain's divorce from the European Union is now officially underway in what promises to be a lengthy and messy disengagement with remaining member states. And President Donald Trump is creating new jobs at the White House, but critics say he's filling those positions with people very, very close to him. Hello and welcome to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, some of the deadliest fighting so far as Iraqi forces continue the battle to retake the old city of Mosul. Soldiers say resistance from Islamic State fighters in the western parts of the city has been fierce. And now new reports suggest desperate militants are forcing people to stay in their homes and shooting civilians and entire families who try to flee. VOA's Heather Murdoch has our report from Mosul.
We're standing about 200 meters outside the old city, and you can hear fighting behind me. Soldiers say the reason why we're not seeing civilians fleeing is not because they don't want to flee, but because Islamic State militants are targeting them with sniper fire. Besides IS snipers, Mosul residents are victims of airstrikes, car bombs, executions, and mortars from both sides. Civilian death tolls are soaring. As many as 8,000 people per day have fled Mosul in recent weeks, but officials say that number is decreasing because more civilians are trapped. Outside this camp, families that escaped say they saw other people trying to flee, arrested or murdered by IS.
May God banish them and cure us from this evil.
The past week has seen some of the most brutal fighting since operations to retake Iraq from Islamic State militants began in October, and soldiers have been fighting around the edges of Mosul's old city for weeks. Trapping civilians, officials say, is IS's strategy to slow down the battle with human shields.
And for a broader picture now of what's going on in western Mosul, we are joined on Skype from Erbil in Kurdish Iraq by VOA's Middle East correspondent Heather Murdoch. Welcome, Heather. And also on Skype, VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb. I thank you ladies for joining us. Heather, let me start with you, and thank you, by the way, for that report. So, is there anywhere that's safe right now for civilians in the western parts of Mosul?
Western Mosul is pretty much entirely a disaster zone. In the areas that are relatively safe, meaning the Iraqi forces have held the area for more than a month, there's not necessarily as much or any mortar fire on the edges of the city, but they don't have any food or water, electricity. I'm sorry, they do have some food, but there's no running water and no electricity. When you get closer to the battles, inside the battle has been the deadliest for the civilians in recent weeks since operations began. And outside the battle zones, there's still sniper fire, mortars, and other weaponry being sent out by Islamic State militants to civilian neighborhoods.
Right. And Carla, as you heard Heather say, there's really very few places for civilians to go. They've essentially become pawns in this war. And now we're hearing reports of civilians sort of being herded into booby-trapped buildings and being forced to stay there. What do you know about that, and what are you hearing?
Well, the Pentagon has said that they have evidence of Islamic State fighters herding these individuals, these civilians, into homes and forcing them in and booby-trapping the areas. Like you said, there's evidence that the Pentagon said they received Wednesday of seeing this happening and having one civilian refusing to go into the house, and so the ISIS fighter shoots him. Then there's also been instances that Iraqi security forces have seen the generals on the ground, General Votel, who's the leader of Central Command, and General Stephen Townsend, who is the ground commander for coalition forces, have both said that there were instances that the Iraqis came up on. One time, 45 civilians were put into a house rigged to explode. Another time, they came across 25 civilians being placed in a building rigged to explode. Luckily, the Iraqi security forces were able to disable the bombs and get them out. But this is such a really difficult time for civilians going through, in addition to the Iraqis fighting the war.
So they do have evidence of that, right, Carla?
Yes,
okay.
They have video. They have not released that yet, but they're trying to get that cleared to release.
Heather, let me get back to you. The people you've interviewed, do they have evidence to back up those claims?
A couple of weeks ago, we met the first person who told us that 19 of his family members had died in an airstrike, and I kind of thought it was a fluke that I met this person. Since then, every other person I met has told stories of large-scale deaths in their families in recent weeks. The booby trap thing, I'm not sure the extent of these explosives, but they've been finding explosives in homes that IS occupied, in IS-occupied areas since the beginning of the operation. So lots of Mosul is covered in landmines and booby traps. So according to civilian eyewitness accounts, yes, absolutely.
So, Carla, the fighting appears to have intensified by all reports here. Are Iraqi forces making any kind of progress right now?
It's slow and steady, the officials here at the Pentagon say, because of these extra booby traps and this new tactic that officials are talking about. There have been upwards of 800 Iraqi force members that have been killed between East Mosul and West Mosul. So this is not easy going for them. They knew that this was coming. They knew how difficult it was going to be. I mean, imagine going into a city filled with people who have either been forced in or having to stay in, and then having streets that are small enough so you can't even fit a tank in there to go in. So it's an incredibly difficult situation.
It's a really disturbing situation that's going on there. Heather, you've also reported some harrowing accounts of civilians possibly becoming victims of possible chemical attacks. What kind of evidence are you hearing of that? Are people talking to you about that issue?
Yes, people are still talking about the issue because the chemicals that were in the weapons are still in the houses that were hit. And we're not talking about weapons of mass destruction. We're talking about homemade chemical bombs. Things like police told us they found sulfur and chlorine. The ICRC said the symptoms the patients exhibited appeared to be from mustard gas. So we've been to about 5 sites. None of them have really been cleaned up. One is so bad that you really can't go into the house for more than a minute without getting ill. And it speaks to sort of the general neglect of Mosul. That was the situation prior to ISIS coming in. And a lot of analysts will say that this neglect and this discontent is part of the reason ISIS gained power there in the first place. So it is troublesome.
So what kind of symptoms are these people reporting?
The attacks that are allegedly at the beginning of March, there were blistering skin. 2 children were in critical condition. Lots of people have had respiratory problems. Lots of people in the streets will say they have eye problems. They can't sleep. At night, they feel like they're choking. And when it rains, even now, the stench is as strong as it was almost right after the attacks.
Yeah. All right, Carl, let me get back into with you on this one. I want to talk about the March 17th air raid that killed 100 civilians. What has the U.S. military said about those deaths? Do they feel responsible for the deaths of those civilians?
Well, they're investigating that instance right now. There is a formal investigation. They have assessed that the civilian casualty allegations are credible, and they're moving forward on that. General Stephen Townsend, who I was telling you about earlier, the ground commander, said that there's a fair chance that the United States did do this. They have sent people down there. There was a strike on this particular building at the time of these casualties. What is not in that picture, though, is the amount of munitions that were used and the type of munitions that were used, according to U.S. officials, were nowhere near anything that could take down that building. Let me give you an example. If they used a Hellfire missile, that radius, that kill radius, is about 15 meters. That's not going to take down a big building. Right. So that's why they're trying to see if maybe this is one of those instances where, yes, they were taking out a sniper on a roof, but the building exploded because of other bombs that had been placed by the Islamic State. We will have to find out as this investigation moves forward. Officials now have given us the bare information, but they want to make sure they fully investigate before they give a final report.
All right. I thank you, Carla, and thank you, Heather. Please stay safe. Time now for our first break. But when we come back, Britain officially filed for divorce from the European Union this week. What does it mean for the UK, for Europe, and for global trade in general? This is The Correspondents on Voice of America.
Health news and notes. This is Living Better.
Want to live to be over age 90? Then just be a girl born in South Korea in 2030 and your chances are good. New research indicates that South Koreans top the list of countries where people will live the longest in the near future, due to factors such as good childhood nutrition, low blood pressure, and low smoking rates. South Korea has become highly developed in public health, says Kim Chung-oh of the Yonsei University College of Medicine. And it is true, it is much easier for people to use medical care, he says. The study in the medical journal Lancet predicts life expectancy at birth for South Korean women will be 90.8 years in 2030, and just over 84 years for men. Other countries with the highest increases in health expectancy for women are Slovenia and Portugal, and Hungary for men. I'm Martin Seacrest for VOA's Living Better.
VOA, telling America's story for more than 70 years.
This is the voice speaking from America and the war.
VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech.
Close the waters.
In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real. VOA, sharing a voice that says, we report the truth.
And welcome back. I'm Mil Arcega in Washington. Well, Britain's exit from the European Union is officially underway after British Prime Minister Theresa May this week triggered Article 50 to begin the process of disengagement with the EU. Now, Britain's decision to leave the trading bloc has been divisive, but it calls attention to whether globalization has actually been good for communities. Now, in Bristol, a group of citizens, including Brexit opponents, is trying to stop the flow of money and jobs out of the city. VOA Europe correspondent Luis Ramirez has our story.
There is very little that Britons agree on when it comes to Brexit, but everyone agrees that ending 4 decades of integration with Europe will be a messy process.
The effect of European Union law is all pervasive, from constitutional level questions to the regulation of bananas and cucumbers at the bottom end of the spectrum. So it is a mammoth task that will not be negotiated within 2 years. It will take a decade or decades to give full effect to EU withdrawal.
The formal withdrawal will take time. In Bristol, the strike against globalism and homogeneity began 5 years ago with the launching of the Bristol pound, a currency whose value is equal to the pound sterling but can only be spent in the city. For local businesses like this non-profit bike repair shop and cafe, it is about keeping money in the local economy and quality of life.
And joining us now to talk about how this messy divorce is likely to impact London, European trade, as well as the larger global economy, we are joined from our London studio by VOA European correspondent and London bureau chief Luis Ramirez, who filed that report for us, and right here in Washington by VOA senior economics editor Jim Randall, my business colleague. Thank you very much for joining us both. Luis, so I want to talk about your the story you just did. So in Bristol, which I believe is west of London, merchants there want consumers to buy local. Isn't that essentially what Brexit aims to do? Buy British goods and fewer European products? Isn't that basically it?
That's pretty much the spirit, or a large part of the spirit behind Brexit, taking back control, a statement against globalism and homogeneity.
So Jim, how does this affect bananas and cucumbers being sold in London? I mean, how does this affect the European single market?
The biggest thing that is going to affect the economy is, as Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chief, said, is years of tremendous uncertainty. And if lenders, company managers and so forth, if they're not certain about the outcome, they're not certain about the background of what's going on economically, they're reluctant. They're either not going to lend money or they're going to lend money at higher interest rates. And this lack of lending, this lack of economic activity tends to slow down the whole economy. A slower economy means fewer jobs and more problems.
So the problem there is essentially a departure from the status quo.
Exactly. A future uncertainty, and the uncertainties just keep piling on. We have a new administration in Washington that has said it's less interested in international affairs, and they got elected on taking a hard line on trade. We're looking at elections in in France and Germany, and the outcome of that is going to be interesting. More and more uncertain.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure, about the impact on other countries, Jim. But I want to get Luis back in this. So, Luis, those bonds between Europe and Britain that we once thought were unbreakable, that's no longer the case. So tell us about Article 50. What happens once Article 50 is invoked?
Well, Article 50 is the part of the provision in the Lisbon Treaty that lets countries take the off-ramp, if you would, get out of the EU. No one's ever done it before. A very lengthy process that, as my report said, is not really going to be completed in a matter of 2 years. We're talking about something like 39,000 19,000 laws that have to be either absorbed or revoked. Yes, governing everything, child safety seats. But really the most important issue is immigration, the flow of people. We've got 3.3 million EU citizens living in the UK, and the big question is now, what is their fate? Are they going to be told to go home, or are they going to be allowed to stay? Very likely they will be allowed to stay. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said that Britain wants to remain an open country. Of course, the aim is, according to her in the draft that's been presented, the white paper, it's an early priority to discuss this, to see what's going to happen to them. What we do know is that what Britain is going to want from here on is more skilled laborers rather than some of the low-skilled labor that's been coming.
Jim Randall, I do hear the argument that they want to be more open, but I get the sense that this is a way to sort of keep Great Britain a little bit close.
Clearly, immigration was one of the worries that drove the Brexit vote. That's that's going to be a problem because there's huge numbers of citizens of both sides in both places. That's going to be interesting working out. The other thing that was the drive to deregulate, the feeling by people who voted in favor of Brexit that there was too much regulation from Brussels, that these out-of-touch bureaucrats were putting regulations, as Luis said, on baby seats and bananas and whatnot. But going forward, it's kind of hard to figure out, will they be able to slash this regulation? Because if as they haggle back and forth with the rest of the EU over the terms of trade in the future, the EU is not going to be happy to let Britain slash regulation and give an advantage to British exporters over their local companies, and so that's going to be a tough negotiation.
So, along with the uncertainty, there's more red tape. Essentially, is what we're probably.
Well, they're trying to cut red tape, but there's 2 points of view. There's there's winners and losers. This could be a zero-sum game, and that makes for a tough negotiation.
Right, Luis. I'm running low on time, but I know Scotland voted 62% in favor of staying with Europe. What does this mean for Scotland's future within the United Kingdom?
Well, it brings back the question of whether Scotland should be independent. And of course, we saw a new move now, another milestone reached to perhaps allow call for a new referendum for Scottish independence. Now, the executive there, Nicola Sturgeon, seems to have quite a mandate, considering that of Scotland's 32 voting districts, not one voted to leave the EU.
So it looks like the UK may be getting smaller as we speak. I thank you, Luis Ramirez in London, and Jim Randall right here in Washington. But right now it's time for another quick break. When we come back, another busy week at the White House. We'll try to bring you up to date on some new appointments and some staffing changes that are going on there. But first, a reminder, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments on our Facebook page. The address is VOA The Correspondents. We'll be right back.
And technology, here's what's new.
It was the worst offshore oil disaster in U.S. history at the Deepwater Horizon in April of 2010. An explosion killed 11 workers and almost 5 million barrels of oil spewed into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, researchers at Argonne National Laboratory in Lamont, Illinois have developed their oleo sponge material that one day might be able to help in such spills. The sponge is made of a polyurethane foam, and thanks to nanotechnology, the foam's interior surfaces are covered with oil-attracting molecules that draw oil from the water. The material has been tested inside a giant seawater tank in New Jersey at the National Oil Spill Test Facility, catching diesel and crude oil from both below and on top of the water. The sponge might be practical for use on a regular basis to clean oil that collects in harbors and ports from shipping traffic. For VOA's What's New, I'm Martin Seacrest.
How do you see the world?
I see countries in turmoil.
I see our planet changing.
I see people at peace.
No matter how you see the world, you'll get an unbiased and uncensored view of it on Voice of America. On television, radio, online, and mobile. In more than 40 languages, all day, every day. Millions of people tune us in.
How do I see the world? On Voice of America.
And welcome back to the Correspondents on Voice of America. I'm Millar Sega in Washington. Well, White House senior aide Jared Kushner agreed this week to speak to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about meetings he had with Russians during last year's presidential campaign. But now, President Donald Trump is adding to his son-in-law's already growing portfolio, appointing him to head a new White House initiative. VOA White House Bureau Chief Correspondent Steve Herman has the details.
We found that a lot of
the second-generation real estate investor who is married to Trump's daughter Ivanka is to lead the new White House Office of American Innovation. It will try to make the federal government run more like an efficient business. The new office will operate out of the powerful West Wing of the White House and be staffed by former business executives from such corporations as Microsoft and General Motors, as well as the Goldman Sachs Investment Bank. At Monday's White House briefing, the press secretary brushed off questions about whether the 36-year-old Kushner, a newcomer to government, is qualified to lead the office, including the Middle East peace process and being his father-in-law's lead advisor on countries such as China and Mexico.
And if you've ever really dealt with the government and recognized how outdated and unmodernized some of this is, it is not serving the American people. It is not serving the constituents that many departments have. And I think looking at how we procure different things and procure technology in particular is important.
So, is the young real estate investor and presidential son-in-law the most qualified person for that new office? To talk about that White House appointment, as well as other noteworthy developments happening at 1600 Pennsylvania, we are joined here in Washington by VOA White House correspondent Pete Heinlein. Welcome back, Pete.
Thank you, Mil.
Certainly
nice
never a dull moment at the White House. There's also always something going on. But I want to know a little bit more about this American Office of Innovation. What exactly is that aimed to do?
Big name, but and what they're taking on is a pretty big job, and that is trying to revitalize the bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy
cut through the red tape and get some innovative kinds of
get people in the bureaucracy to start thinking like a business, the way the Trump business is run, for instance, where things get done in the private sector, things get done. The perception among many in the countryside is that the bureaucracy is this great big lumbering behemoth that seems to go nowhere, takes up a lot of money and time and taxpayer
money. But let me
money.
play devil's advocate here, Pete. I mean, if you're trying to cut through the bureaucracy, why create another one? I mean, my understanding is the Commerce Department is in charge of these kinds of innovation in business. So why add another layer?
Well, I think this is not a bureaucracy they're setting up. They're having a few people who are going to look over these things. These are people who already have private sector jobs, except for Jared Kushner, who is steeped in private sector ideas and methods, and to try to say, look, we can do things a lot faster, a lot better.
This is a position that does not require Senate confirmation, correct?
No, it doesn't.
It does not require. So, but there has been a lot of criticism, obviously, because of the nature of his relationship with the president,
Right.
correct?
Well, Kushner is already in the government, and that has led to charges of nepotism. He was cleared by the Department of Justice in January, who said he can work, although he's not taking money for it. Now the question of his wife, Ivanka Trump.
Yeah. He now has a big office there.
Right,
in the
has
West Wing.
just gotten a big West Wing office, a lot bigger than ours, by the way.
I've seen your office, and you're right.
And it's tiny. But then the question is, again, nepotism. But she's, again, working for nothing. She was already working for nothing. So the lawyers seem to think that she might be able to skate by. Critics, of course, say, my goodness, he's surrounding himself with his whole family.
No, and I mean, I was kind of reading some of the stories that you guys have put together, you and Steve Herman. So I checked the Merriam-Webster dictionary for the definition of nepotism, and it says, the unfair practice by a powerful person of giving jobs and other favors to relatives.
I did the same thing.
That seems to be the actual standard definition of what we're seeing there.
It is, but back in the old days, the idea was presidents and others would give jobs to their relatives who could then make money. The idea was they were sinecures.
Right. So this is unlikely an issue that's going to stick. The White House should be able to go through this.
Not in the same way, but in this highly charged partisan atmosphere, everybody's looking.
Speaking of highly charged partisan atmosphere, Jared Kushner has agreed to be questioned by the Intelligence Committee in Congress. What kinds of questions do they want to hear from him? What do they want to know from Jared Kushner?
They want to know who he talked to as a businessman and whether those talks kind of filtered over into his role with the candidate and President-elect Trump, especially during the period between the election and when President Trump took office. There were a lot of contacts with Russians, including the Russian ambassador to Washington, Sergei Kislyak, and they want to know was the subject broached about possibly dispensing with sanctions that are on Russia?
This whole Russian story seems to have sidetracked the White House in many ways. Is it something that they're trying to sort of go beyond and they're unable to? What is the mood there in the White House?
Well, I think the bunker mentality is there. To say highly charged is almost an understatement when you talk about what's going on in the battle between the media and the political opposition on one side and the
now
Trump
former National
Security
Security Advisor Michael Flynn, there are reports or rumors that he may be seeking some kind of immunity in exchange for testimony. What do you make of that?
Well, everybody's making a lot of it right now. Flynn himself was quoted as saying last year, well, anybody who seeks immunity must be guilty of something.
Boom.
Yeah, and others, Donald Trump, for instance, was questioning whether Clinton people could request immunity. Right. And he, too, said, anybody who's doing that is obviously...
I've got like 30 seconds, Pete. So what's on tap for the White House next week? What are we going to be talking about next week?
Well, next week, of course, we've got 3 heads of state visiting. We have the King of Jordan is visiting. We have the President of Egypt, and the big one at the end of the week is the President of China, Xi Jinping.
Wow, you guys are going to be super busy.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this,
My
Pete.
pleasure.
We do
Thank
appreciate
you,
it,
Bill.
but that's our show. Thank you so much, Pete Heinlein. We hope you join us again next week for another edition of The Correspondents. But as we close our show today, it is with great sadness that we mark the passing of one of our longtime colleagues. Dave DeForest was a broadcaster for VOA's English news programs. He was a constant presence in our global hourly newscasts for 2 decades, and obviously a class act who was heard by millions around the world. Dave DeForest was a consummate professional. Just ask any of his colleagues. He was a gentle, dignified soul, a man loved by all he came in contact with. Our condolences go to his family. He will, of course, be sorely missed. Dave DeForest, rest in peace.